From a maroon Ford Focus getting totally boxed in, to a stolen pest control truck plowing head-on into oncoming traffic, all the way to a massive pickup truck ripping the bumper completely off a state trooper's cruiser. These are the moments when desperate criminals were stopped by brutal PIT maneuvers. It was just after 8 in the morning on a completely standard Monday, exactly when most normal folks are quietly grabbing their coffee. None of those innocent people expected to be violently sharing Interstate 57 with a completely stolen white GMC pickup violently running from North Little Rock police officers. Heavily armed Arkansas state troopers aggressively joined the wildly chaotic pursuit, rapidly chasing the massive truck as it violently pushed its way furiously toward the Jacksonville city limits. A male passenger had previously bailed completely out of the moving truck, leaving the desperate female driver completely alone to wildly face the heavily armed swarm. After completely causing total high-speed chaos across the packed interstate, the panicked driver wildly ripped the heavy steering wheel and violently took a completely random highway exit. What she totally didn't realize was that a massive wall of heavily armed state troopers was already aggressively waiting just ahead, and they absolutely weren't giving her a single ounce of mercy. An incredibly aggressive state trooper violently lined up his heavy patrol cruiser and delivered a completely brutal, high-speed pit maneuver that practically shattered the rigid laws of physics. The incredibly heavy stolen truck violently lifted the entire front end of the trooper's patrol unit, aggressively ripping off the entire bumper and completely crunching the headlights. The wildly massive impact sent a huge shower of broken plastic and twisted metal violently flying across the pavement, but the incredibly brave trooper completely held his ground. The violently spinning truck aggressively rotated around and violently smashed right back into the heavily damaged police cruiser, but the dedicated officer totally refused to let her escape. The incredibly violent, strictly controlled force practically brought the massively heavy truck to a completely grinding halt, stopping the wildly reckless driver before she could violently plow into a nearby high school. They violently ripped the completely defeated woman out of the heavily crushed driver's seat, officially ensuring absolutely zero innocent kids were put at risk by her massively terrible decisions. It genuinely takes a whole lot to surprise the seasoned troopers of the Florida Highway Patrol, but seeing a battered white Honda Civic flying blindly down the shoulder of Interstate 95 totally grabbed their attention. 19-year-old Abel Campos was aggressively gripping the wheel, completely testing the absolute mechanical limits of his little sedan and the rapidly thinning patience of every law enforcement officer in North Miami-Dade. The second the trooper flipped on his emergency sirens, Campos didn't even bother tapping his brakes. He violently launched his car straight off the pavement and totally disappeared into a massive, heavily active construction zone. He completely vanished into thick, blinding plumes of white dust, violently bouncing his suspension over massive dirt mounds and narrowly dodging heavy yellow excavators. Instead of realizing his battered sedan was totally outmatched by the brutal terrain, Campos doubled down on his terrible decisions and violently swerved his vehicle onto the completely wrong side of the interstate. He brazenly drove head-on toward fast-moving oncoming traffic, completely turning a standard, reckless flight into a genuinely lethal situation for every single driver. The pursuing troopers instantly realized they couldn't let this continue, aggressively cornering his wildly swerving car back into the deep construction dirt. One of the lead interceptors lined up a completely flawless, violently executed pit maneuver, striking the Honda's rear quarter panel and sending it violently sliding sideways. The brutal impact officially ended his chaotic high-speed joyride, completely trapping the crushed Honda with absolutely zero room left for another escape attempt. Campos frantically stumbled out of the crumpled driver's door, immediately threw his hands high up in the air, and totally flattened himself against the loose dirt. He surrendered to the heavily armed troopers without throwing a single punch, realizing his airborne stunts and wrong-way driving weren't nearly enough to outrun the radio. A massive stolen pest control flatbed truck violently turned the quiet streets of Henry County, Georgia, into a total high-speed war zone during a painfully humid afternoon in June. 31-year-old Daniel Waldrop wasn't just casually running from the law. He'd completely crossed the line by attempting to violently run over a Henry County officer before the chase even officially began. That incredibly reckless act immediately triggered shots fired from the police, completely escalating the situation and bringing a helicopter buzzing fiercely overhead. With the Georgia State Patrol practically fused to his rear bumper, Waldrop pushed the heavy work truck to its absolute limits. The heavily abused flatbed completely shredded its front tires across the hot asphalt, but Waldrop aggressively gripped the wheel and brazenly swerved the massive rig onto the wrong side of the road. He drove completely head-on into terrified oncoming civilian traffic, proving he didn't care who got totally wrecked as long as he managed to escape the cops. Two separate, highly aggressive PIT attempts barely even fazed the massive vehicle, and pursuing officers quickly realized they were dealing with a wildly unstoppable rolling battering ram. Troopers knew they couldn't just gently tap him into submission, so they aggressively swarmed the heavy truck. They forcefully ran the massive rig completely off the paved roadway, violently plowing it deep into a thick, grassy ditch and burying its front bumper deep into the wet mud. Even with his battered truck completely stuck and totally surrounded, Waldrop stubbornly refused to quit, frantically trying to claw his way out of the wreckage. Heavily armed officers aggressively swarmed the battered cab, forcefully yanking him from the driver's seat after a brutal, incredibly hands-on physical struggle right there in the dirt. They violently dragged him up the steep grassy embankment, slapping the heavy cuffs on his wrists and finally putting an absolute stop to his murderous joyride. It was completely broad daylight in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when highly alert Glendale officers easily spotted a stolen white Volkswagen SUV that had been heavily tied to a violently armed home invasion. The heavily damaged vehicle was completely out in the open on Port Washington Road, proving that stolen cars always seem to blatantly show up in the most incredibly predictable places. The moment the heavily armed officers fell in aggressively behind the bumper, the panicked driver didn't even attempt to slow down or play it cool for a single second. They violently mashed the accelerator, wildly taking off down the city streets and doing exactly what every single terrible decision on four wheels aggressively does. The wildly unpredictable chase heavily involved highly dangerous suspects, meaning the pursuing officers aggressively applied pressure while carefully maintaining a completely safe distance. With absolutely every single high-speed turn, the suspects' erratic driving got wildly worse, incredibly dangerous, and wildly desperate as they frantically searched for a completely non-existent escape route. The chaos wildly escalated to a completely new level when the panicked suspect violently veered the heavy SUV completely off the pavement and violently tore straight through a completely innocent public park. They wildly plowed the stolen vehicle straight through metal road signs, completely destroying city property, while violently bouncing the heavy suspension completely over the torn-up grass. Finally, a highly skilled officer practically saw the exact opening he desperately needed, cleanly lining up his heavy patrol cruiser while the stolen SUV's speed was totally manageable. He aggressively executed a completely flawless, bone-shattering pit maneuver, violently spinning the stolen Volkswagen out of control and forcefully sending it completely crashing into the hard pavement. Heavily armed officers completely swarmed the violently wrecked vehicle, shockingly discovering four totally different suspects, completely spanning three separate generations, forcefully packed inside the stolen cab. They violently dragged a 35-year-old woman, an 18-year-old woman, and two heavily terrified teenage boys out of the wreckage, heavily slapping the cuffs on all of them. Down in Clayton County, Georgia, on a blisteringly hot September afternoon, a sheriff's deputy spotted a suspicious white Nissan rental car that totally triggered his instincts. A desperate woman was aggressively yanking on the passenger door, but the absolute second the driver locked eyes with the approaching patrol cruiser, he slammed the gas pedal and completely abandoned her. The deputy's dashboard radar caught the screeching Nissan instantly hitting 64 miles per hour in a quiet 35 zone, violently kicking off a wildly chaotic scramble. The desperate suspect whipped a reckless U-turn, completely ignoring the flashing lights as he forced his way onto the interstate. The fleeing driver, a guy identified as Mr. Hunt, violently swerved away from an early pit maneuver attempt and pushed the screaming rental car to nearly 100 miles per hour. He was erratically darting across multiple lanes of heavy highway traffic, whipping past terrified commuters and driving with a reckless desperation they couldn't tolerate. Realizing the danger was totally spiraling out of control, Deputy Ford aggressively found his opening, mashed his heavy cruiser's accelerator, and delivered a bone-shattering ramming technique. The violent impact sent the white Nissan violently spinning completely out of control, totally neutralizing the massive public threat. Hunt wasn't ready to give up his freedom, so he frantically dove headfirst out the open driver's side window while the wrecked car was practically still moving. He desperately sprinted across the wide, grassy highway median, hoping his sudden burst of adrenaline-fueled athleticism would keep him totally out of handcuffs. His wild dash didn't last very long at all, because a perfectly aimed taser deployment instantly locked up his muscles and dropped him heavily face-first into the dirt. Deputies meticulously scoured the crushed rental car and found wads of cash alongside obvious signs of a drug operation, proving exactly why he'd been so totally desperate to escape. The seasoned troopers of the Florida Highway Patrol's Criminal Interdiction Unit were aggressively patrolling Interstate 95, exactly the kind of spot where terrible decisions naturally revealed themselves. On this specific afternoon, those totally terrible decisions loudly pulled up in a sleek black Hyundai, carrying two extremely nervous individuals who were already incredibly well known to local law enforcement. Police intelligence instantly confirmed the driver and his passenger were heavily tied to a massive drug trafficking operation, making them highly desperate and totally unpredictable targets. The absolute instant Trooper Ziegler aggressively lit up his blinding emergency lights, the terrified driver selfishly hit the gas. The wildly reckless sedan shot violently down the open interstate, erratically weaving through heavy civilian traffic and aggressively cutting across multiple lanes like it owned the asphalt. They completely abused the emergency shoulder like a VIP passing lane, so Trooper Diaz Bueno aggressively took over the primary pursuit position to forcefully shut them down. Every single highly calculated attempt to pit the speeding vehicle was violently dodged with desperate last-second swerves that practically ripped the steering wheel right off the column. The suspect literally drove like he totally forgot he wasn't invincible, wildly acting like he was starring in a high-budget, completely untouchable getaway movie. After a wildly dangerous game of cat and mouse, the troopers finally violently swarmed the speeding sedan, aggressively forcing it to a grinding, brutal halt on the highway shoulder. The panicked driver, Justin Crosby, was violently pulled out of the driver's seat and heavily detained, boldly admitting he didn't stop because he simply had way too much to lose. A highly meticulous search of the crushed vehicle revealed a massive buffet of illegal narcotics, including foil-wrapped meth, a perfectly rolled dollar bill, and multiple bags of completely unregulated substances. They even found a completely stolen Colorado ID card hidden deep inside his wallet, earning them both a totally non-refundable trip to the Brevard County Jail.